sacking by P&O Ferries of all its British seafarers is a serious attack on the whole trade union movement and poses a serious threat to all workers' conditions and living standards. This disgraceful sacking has sent shockwaves around the labour movement, and if it is not beaten back, it will be followed by similar moves by a whole range of employers. The 800 P&O workers were fired by a pre-recorded video message after all the company's ferries had been ordered back to port, including this chilling message: "This is your last day of employment." The unceremonious sacking was even worse than the usual fire and rehire tactic, being followed immediately by their replacement with agency workers on worse pay and condition. Because the ferries are plying international waters, they're not subject to national or EU workers' rights, and the new crews may earn as little as £2.60 an hour. Not only had P&O already signed up agency workers, but many of them were waiting on buses to take over the ferries from their former crews. Unsurprisingly, many P&O workers were so outraged by this treatment that they initially refused to leave the ferries. Despite threats, the handcuffed trained security staff might be used to clear the ships. Many of the workers sacked have worked in this industry for years, in some cases for decades. Most of them have worked during the pandemic and feel that they now have just been cast aside. It also raises serious safety concerns for the operations of the ferries. As one navigation officer who lost his job told the Belfast Telegraph, "While all the new crew on board now are certified," he said, "normal procedure is that when there's any change on a ship, there's a familiarization period to go through. With someone who is familiar, they're able to show people around. This time there's been no official handover." Now, the government have apparently directed the Coast Guard service to check the ferry and seek assurances as to the quality of the new crew. But as with other issues, we should expect nothing from this gesture. There's been such a massive public outcry at the manner of the P&O sackings that even Tory ministers have been forced to respond to it. Transport Secretary Grant Sharps has expressed his deep concern and has apparently questioned whether the sackings were legal or broke employment laws as they apply to redundancies. Their main concern seems to be the undue haste and the insensitivity of P&O rather than the sackings themselves, as if the sackings were acceptable, if only 30 days notice had been given. It has also now been revealed that P&O ferries are being investigated by the pensions regulator and concerns that they failed to pay a £146 million deficit. The Merchant Navy Ratings Pension Fund has a total deficit of £1.25 billion and P&O shortfall. It's been suggested it's secured against two of the company's older ferries, which are probably not worth the amount anyway. We have all heard the bluster of the Tories before, long before Margaret Thatcher's day. It was nearly 50 years ago that the Tory Prime Minister Ted Heath referred to the excesses of the Lonhro Company as the unacceptable face of capitalism. Similar weasel words have been about from other scandals, most recently the role of Sir Philip Green in the collapse of BHS. What these scandals have all in common is that, despite Tory rhetoric about how bad they are, they lead to no substantial change to the behaviour of the companies involved, and no jobs were saved. In fact, apart from the hot air, the sum total of Tory opposition to the P&O sacking so far has been for two government ministers to write separate letters to the wrong person, the former chairman of P&O, to express their concern. Just as Boris Johnson has weathered the storm over his COVID lockdown parties, if you want to remember that for a second, the Tories will want to ride this storm out, doing as little as possible besides grandstanding. The Labour movement must conduct its own fight and on its own terms. P&O operate ferry services from mainland Britain to Ireland, France and the Netherlands, and as well as ship crews they employ workers portside. All of these workers will now be fearing for their jobs and conditions, because if P&O are allowed to get away with these sackings, it will be the dockers in Southampton and London next. These sackings are a challenge to the whole trade union movement, and they are a test of what the leaders of the union are prepared to do. Companies up and down the country will be watching carefully to see if P&O can get away with these disgraceful sackings. And if they do, no workers' jobs will be safe anywhere. The game of pitting UK workers against cheap foreign labour is one that the employers will play again, and the trade union must answer this with workers' solidarity. The Labour movement cannot rely on appeals to law, and definitely not to Tory ministers. It has to conduct its own fight for the P&O jobs and on its own terms. Rallies have already been held in Dover, Hull and Liverpool, and there will undoubtedly be a lot more to come. The main union involved, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, RMT, should be given the full backing of the labour and trade union movement. This issue will be a test for a Labour leadership too. Keir Starmer and his team have repeated that Labour is under new management, as if it weren't obvious to every Labour member suffering the indignity of a stifling atmosphere of bureaucracy and censorship. But now the Starmer team has come up with the goods. What will be their answer? What measures will they demand of the government? Will they support militant actions by workers to defend their jobs and to boycott P&O in the meantime? To their disgrace, the Labour leadership haven't even made a statement against fire and rehire, even though it is a policy passed by a Labour conference. If the Labour leadership had an ounce of fighting spirit of the founders of the party, they would be demanding that P&O should be nationalised and the ferries confiscated with minimal compensation. Public opinion would be perfectly at ease with shareholder compensation being the same as the redundancy payment offered to ferry crews. Through taxpayer-funded government aid and public contracts, as well as dividends already paid, P&O shareholders have had their cut and deserve nothing more. In reality, a rational and planned transport sector, one that functions in the interest of the whole population, could only be based by one that involves the public ownership of the whole ferry sector, as well as ports and associated facilities. As long as these are operated for the enrichment of a tiny minority of people, including wealthy overseas owners, they will not serve the interest of the population as a whole. P&O should be a watershed for the whole labour and trade union movement. A signal that the onslaught on living standards ends now. If there has ever been a time for a militant fight back in the political and industrial spheres, it is now.